Accessing library computer data.
And to make sure that history never forgets the name Enterprise.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Pensky Podcast. If you haven't tuned in before, this is a podcast where we are running through all 178 episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, giving our thoughts and feelings about each and every one. Right now we're up to episode 12 of season 4. This one is called The Wounded. It was directed by Chip Chalmers, teleplay goes to Jerry Taylor, and it aired back on January 28, 1991. In this episode, Picard is shocked when a highly respected captain apparently turns renegade and begins destroying Cardassian vessels. Eric and Richard from Trekabout are going to join us for this one, so right after this audio break, me, Eric, and Richard are going to go deep on The Wounded.
Welcome aboard, sir. I'm Commander Riker, First Officer.
I know all about you, Commander. Fine work you did with the Borg. We all owe you on that one.
Thank you, sir.
O'Brien? Miles O'Brien?
Hello, Captain. Good to see you again.
How are you? I had no idea you were on the Enterprise. This was my tactical officer on the Rutledge. Best I ever had.
Thank you, sir.
O'Brien has the ability to size up a situation instantly and come up with options to fit all contingencies. Remarkable.
Well, if that's true, I learned it from you, sir.
But you got that silver tongue by kissing the stone, right? Well, Commander, best I see your captain straight away. We got a lot to talk about.
Eric, Richard, good to have you back on the podcast. How are you guys?
We're great. Thanks for having us back.
Great
We're happy
to be
here.
back.
Absolutely. People enjoyed your episode. Think you guys did pretty well. Hopefully you got a couple small number of listeners added onto you guys. But yeah, we're going to talk about The Wounded very soon. We're going to talk about The Wounded, the appearance of the Cardassians. And I wanted to have you guys back on for this one, even though you generously were on not too long ago, because I think this episode might be better suited to where you guys are in your podcast, because this one is the introduction of the Cardassians. And you guys are running through Deep Space Nine right now, so you're sort of in Cardassian Central.
That is correct. And I'm sure Richard will have a lot to say about the Cardassians at this point because, he knows a lot more about them at this point than he did when we watched The Wounded in our run through.
Yeah, when we first saw The Wounded, I had not seen any DS9, so this was my introduction to the Cardassians. And, now knowing more, it's been interesting seeing that in a lot of ways, obviously the Cardassians weren't as detailed as they are in DS9, but they're consistent with what we see here.
Yeah, that's something very interesting that I do want to get into. But the first thing I wanted to get off to is I have some good news from the land of fake news for us. So CBS contacted me, right? There's a new Star Trek coming out. They want us three to write the new 13-episode season that's going to air, right? So
how much are they paying us?
They're not paying us anything. We're doing this on spec until they approve the
for
first
exposure.
Script. That's right.
Of course.
This is, it's arts. You do everything for free, and then eventually you make $1 million.
This is exactly how capitalism operates.
Capitalism is the greatest supporter of the arts. So what we're going to do is CBS gave me very specific details about what they want. They want 3 different scripts, one from each of us. What they said is that they want the enemies of this new series to be one of the 6 main antagonist races that are in TNG. And they don't want too much of the same stuff. They didn't want us to come back with 3 Klingon stories. So what we're going to do is they want us to have a fantasy draft of the 6 races that we're going to do.
Okay.
So I'm going to click on this little draft. Where am I? Draftordergenerator.com. I click. We've got an order. We've got Richard. Then we've got Wes. Then we've got Eric. So that's going to be the draft order. What we're going to do is we're going to go Richard, Wes, Eric take a pick. Eric takes another pick. Then me, then Richard. So we've got 6 races, right, that are basically the strong points of TNG. We've got the Borg, the Romulans, the Ferengi, the Klingons, the Cardassians, and the Q. So we're each going to pick one of those, and those are going to be the 2 that you are going to create a new script with. So you have to kind of pick the species that you think are the strongest. Obviously, it's going to rank from best to worst. So in terms of creating a 13-episode story, which of those 6 species, Richard, are you going to pick with your first pick?
Oh God, this is the Q.
Richard is having performance anxiety. The Q? Okay.
The Q.
He said the Q.
Takes the Q. All right, I'm going to take the Cardassians. Eric, what are you going to do?
I will take the Ferengi.
Really? Interesting. That's a sleeper pick, or number 3, I think, right there.
Oh, yeah.
Eric, you get the snake draft here, so you're wrapping around. So what's your second pick? You have the Borg, the Romulans, and the Klingons left.
The Romulans.
Romulans?
God. Then I got...
I'm going to go with the Borg right there, Wes. And Richard, that leaves you with the Klingons.
Okay, I got Klingons in Q.
Richard likes the Klingons, so
I love the
good.
Klingons.
Klingons in Q. Eric, you've got the Romulans and the Ferengi. And I've got the Cardassians.
In my closet.
Cardassians and the Borg. I think, it's hard to say, but I think I came out on top of that one, actually. It's tough. I think I'm surprised the Ferengi went so early. What's the... What do you think is the sort of deciding factor about what races work on Star Trek and what ones don't?
That's a big question. I think, a strong concept, number one. I think a good look for the alien is probably pretty important. I think, one of the reasons why the Ferengi probably didn't work was that they just looked way too goofy. And also, I think that it also depends on how much they can kind of shift and change as needed with a story. So if you kind of have an alien race that has a really, really strong, structure of their society, or sort of like a personality thing or whatever at the outset, I think it's a lot harder to kind of change them into something else, which is also, I think, what we'll talk about when we actually get into discussing the Wounded.
Yeah. It's, out of what I would consider to be the weakest of the TNG sort of antagonists would probably definitely be the Ferengi. I think it might be difficult for you guys. I think Deep Space Nine fixes a lot of these things that come around, but as far as I'm concerned, just looking at a TNG thing, the Ferengi would be way down there. And what I think,
they suck in it. What is the one that keeps harassing Picard over? What is his name?
Damon Bach.
Damon Bach. Yeah, like he's one of the worst villains. He's just.
And I also appreciate the fact when we talked about this, when we talked about the follow-up episode to that way in the 7th season, where it's kind of like, I guess the writers were really running out of ideas, because I think on the list of kind of forgotten plot points from the first season of TNG, I don't think a follow-up to the battle was one of them.
If only, we had another Akano episode.
Yeah, it's one or the other.
he's nice to look at, so I would probably have rather had that, but
He's roguish. He's barely a villain. He's a friendly guy with a smile who just wants to screw everybody on board.
I'm okay with that.
I mean, it was a high point of season 2. But I mean, so we're going to go into this just because I thought that was interesting, just to have a sort of ranking of the villains. They all sort of blend together for me. I think the Borg are a little bit higher, but the Borg have problems story-wise that you can't deal with them too often, just because which Voyager just sort of ignored, which I will not talk about too much because Richard hasn't seen any Voyager, but I don't think Voyager spoilers are that
No, I know the Borg are a much bigger part of Voyager, and from what I know, I get the sense that dilutes them in a way. Like in TNG, they are this, huge, from once we see we'll see later in Descent and all of that, the Borg start to get, weak, and they're not this, the Borg work best when they're this almost Lovecraftian entity. They're just this incomprehensible enemy.
Yeah, exactly. And they, the more you see them, the worse they become is kind of their problem. And that is Voyager's ultimate problem. Deep Space Nine has the Cardassians, who we're going to talk about now. The Wounded. This is Chief O'Brien's follow-up episode to Data's Day. He got married, and now he's living with his wife on the Enterprise.
Eating plankton.
Yeah, eating plankton together. That's apparently not even real plankton. It's just replicated plankton. How long do you believe that Miles O'Brien and Keiko knew each other before they got married?
I'm going to go with 2 weeks.
God, I don't, I liked their relationship when I first saw it. And now I'm starting, like, we saw another O'Brien episode for Deep Space Nine, and I think I said it was like watching insects mate. Like, it's just, there's some, it's like, it's really obvious that the two actors don't like each other. But they're playing a married couple.
I don't think that it's that they don't like each other. I think they just don't have any chemistry.
Yeah,
It's
Richard likes to fill in the gaps with his own like headcanon about what was going on set. And and I just kind of go, I just don't think they have any chemistry. I have no actual evidence that Cole Meany, and I really feel bad that I don't know the actress's name, but we'll call her real Keiko O'Brien.
Yep.
Don't have chemistry. They just don't. I don't think they're in the same room when they're filming these scenes actually at all.
I mean,
they're using like a green screen dummy and they're compositing it in for the sex scenes.
I'm glad there's some TNG sex scenes are exactly what this series needed. I think at this point, it's a weird sort of relationship. It kind of does the typical narrative thing where, like, this is the first time he's ever brought up the fact that what they eat he doesn't care about. It's that kind of a weird situation in a relationship that only happens in narrative fiction, I think.
Yeah, because it's kind of like, guys, you have a replicator. You don't have to eat the same thing.
Right.
That's always my problem in Star Trek is, like Richard and I, like if we're like, I mean, when we used to live together, I mean, we didn't eat the same thing for dinner. Like, and I mean, we were roommates. It wasn't like we were in a romantic relationship.
But I mean,
I know plenty of married couples that don't eat the same thing for dinner. I mean, now, and it's like a bigger deal because you don't have a replicator. So why do they have this problem? I don't know.
Yeah, they put a lot of the replicator's funny because O'Brien in this one says, "I'll replicate something," like he's actually doing work. Instead of just walking over and saying, not even pushing a button, you just say to the computer what you want and it appears. Everyone treats the replicator as if it's some kind of like task that has to be done, and it's really not.
Yeah, it's not like you have to program it or anything.
No, you actually do. Like what you need to do with the replicator, you don't just tell the replicator what you want. You actually have to use a series of VLOOKUPs to program in and like assign the ingredients to this actual recipe, and then it's sort of like you have to have formulas involved and you've got to sum thing. It's complicated.
Yeah, like if Keiko's being a bitch, then give her cold potato salad or whatever the hell he serves up for her.
Oh god, that just neither of those looked good.
I don't even know what to say about the potato casserole. I mean, my family is Irish. My mother and like my grandparents, were Irish. Well, my mother's still alive. I shouldn't say that because that sounds terrible.
But she's not Irish anymore.
Well, I mean, she is. But the food, I don't know what that was. Like, I've never been served that in my life. When I think of Irish food, I think of like, hearty stews.
I don't think of capers.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
Yeah, like I don't think of capers. I don't think of anything that has really like strong flavors.
Like this like French cooking, sure, there's capers in it, but like, yeah.
It's modified Irish. Who knows what was going on in I mean, if a Frenchman can have a British accent, then Ireland in the 24th century, their cuisine can have capers.
It's kind of beautiful. It is very cosmopolitan of him.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a DS9 episode that I think is early second season because I remember watching it. It's O'Brien states his favorite food. He has like a.
Oh yeah, he loves rations.
Yes. Well, no, he loves that. It's that episode where he's got the double. He has like it's some kind of stew.
Oh yeah. Oh god, yeah.
Oh yeah, that episode.
Looked like really bad Indian food.
Yeah, so it looked like a curry, and whatever it was, she doesn't like to make it for him or something. They're still struggling, like 7 years later, with cooking for each other, which is.
But again, like she doesn't like to make it for him. She doesn't like to say, "Please make curry," to the replicator.
Again, I don't get this. They don't have to eat the same thing. They have a replicator. I don't know. Is it a weird?
Yeah. It's like it's almost like going to a restaurant. Like you're able to order whatever you want, and it's no real extra effort on your part. Again, if you're cooking, all right, fine. You buy one thing for a meal, you cook one thing, sure.
Yeah, it's I don't even know. It's one thing if you're doing work to get into it and then you feel bad that the person doesn't need it, but these people are literally doing no work whatsoever. But anyway, let's get into the wounded Cardassian appearance. I'm going to say something. I wanted to know what you guys thought about this. Marco Lamo, I think that's how you pronounce his name. Eric will have to correct me if I'm wrong.
I think that's right.
Marco Lamo plays the captain in this episode, whose name I can't remember because I only remember him as Gul Dukat.
Oh, me too. Cool.
It's Gul Macet.
Gul Macet.
And I will say that I'll get this out of the way because I'm just going to nerd out about Star Trek novels. Gul Macet actually does feature in a few of the Star Trek novels, and he's kind of like, I think they say that he's actually related to Gul Dukat in some way, and that they actually like kind of make a joke of it where Kira is sort of like confused by him and kind of tells him this because she had all these interactions with Gul Dukat over the years. So that's another reason why no one should ever read Star Trek novels.
Yeah, I had a couple growing up. I remember the artwork more than the actual book, which might tell you something about them. The
only Star Trek book I read was a junior. Then I was like 10, and it was about Worf in Starfleet Academy. So that'll tell you about that.
Yeah, there's just some characters that I don't need. I don't know. It feels wrong to sort of continue the adventures outside of what I see on the TV because it's ultimately like more dramatic or something. But anyway, Gul Macet is Marco Lamo. And this is the first, let me know what you guys think. This is the first time I feel that in Star Trek where an actor's performance informed the rest of the species, how they were written.
I can see that. I think that obviously where the Cardassians go, and so in our podcast Trekabout, we're kind of wrapping up the second season of DS9 at this point. And so, Richard doesn't have kind of the whole picture of the Cardassians. But, what we know of them, of course, is that they had this brutal occupation of Bajor. They're really, really terrible in a lot of ways. They have a really sort of autocratic, fascist government kind of thing. They have this sort of like competing governmental structure with this Obsidian Order and the civilian government and the military, and it's all just kind of a mess, right? And I think you're actually on to something there because Marco Lamo's performance in this episode is very cold. It's very distant. He is obviously a guy who is restraining some kind of deep anger or something, and he's also hiding something, obviously. And so I think that
pretty much his entire thing is a lie. Even when the scene when he's talking to Picard and he's saying, there are some people who don't want war, I see you're one of them as well, and he's saying all these beautiful, Star Trek themes, we should get along, we can be, and, as we learn, he is lying through his teeth. Even if he's maybe half telling the truth, he wishes there were no war, but unfortunately it's a necessity kind of a thing. I mean, I can see the Gul Dukat comparisons because, Gul Dukat only half lies for the most part.
Right.
He's never completely full of shit, but, he does have his own agenda the entire time.
Yeah, his performance is interesting to me because I'm pretty sure it's the performance here, and because I was trying to pay attention to the writing, and the two minor Cardassians in this one, one of them doesn't do anything, but the other one who tries to befriend Chief O'Brien, I was watching that the second time thinking you could replace these guys with any other alien species like Klingon or Romulans, and they would be played the exact same way. There's nothing that really changed those characters. The actors in those roles didn't do anything special or unique. What Lamo did was he kind of took the Cardassians and he made them Bond villains. Because what they are is they're exceptionally polite, right? Like even when they're torturing you, they're like polite to you. And they're sort of underhanded, and it's a sort of twisted race that we haven't seen before in Star Trek. And they really developed this a lot stronger. But at this point, I thought it was really just Lamo's good at playing these sort of sleazy, underhanded, but killing you with kindness kind of character.
Well, yeah, very articulate, very, classy in a way, and
right,
culture, as a very civilized brutality.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
I also think it's interesting that, Gul Macet in this episode is lying so much. I mean, it's one of those things where, we like to say on our podcast that the Cardassians are sort of like competent Romulans. And, what I mean by that is, the Romulans have all of these elaborate plans and kind of schemes that never really come to fruition. They all sort of fall apart at the last minute. They're way too complicated. There's just they're not good at this, right?
Right.
But the Cardassians are. I mean, they're obviously very, very calculating. They are a species which makes plans only as complicated as they need to be, and more often than not they actually work. And I think that you kind of are getting the groundwork for that in this episode because of Mark Alema's performance, but also in the writing, the way that the end of the episode is so ambiguous about what exactly the Cardassians are doing. I think it's a very ambiguous ending, and it's one of those things that TNG I think probably didn't do as much of as Deep Space Nine. So it's an interesting episode for that reason as well, I think.
Yeah, this is sorry. This is we'd said seeing some episodes of TNG later on or thinking back on them having seen DS9, you can see them starting to stretch against the boundaries of what this show can do. And this is one of those episodes that this again, it's a very dark, it's an ambiguous ending. It's Next Gen will touch upon those more, but Deep Space Nine gives it the room to kind of run with that. And that's one of the reasons I'm liking that show so much. But, this is very much in TNG as well. I like the ambiguity that's left with the two other Cardassians, though, because it really isn't clear whether they're actually spying or not, I thought, the one who's trying to befriend, O'Brien, is he really trying to figure out, Federation transporter technology, or is he just, lonely and cold and everything's too bright and, here's a guy who has the same job and he can make conversation, Is the other guy really trying to look up the weapons, or is he just genuinely curious about, what the Federation OS is, blundered into the weapons thing and just made a really stupid mistake? It's we can definitely see it going either way, and, perhaps you have one idea or the other, but I think it's interesting that it leaves it kind of unresolved. And frankly, that Picard's point at the end is that he wants this unresolved because if it's resolved, then they have to go to war in a way. Yes. Yeah. He wants, he's choosing the lesser of two evils, basically. Yeah. He's letting the Cardassians get away with their honor and knowing that, we're going to catch you next time, but we're giving you the benefit of a doubt because, if we don't believe you, then that's bad. Yeah. It's, it's funny that you guys sort of mentioned that about this episode, because I think this episode's really interesting because, of the thousands of people that come up to you every day and ask you, what's the tonal difference between TNG and Deep Space Nine? Well, finally have an answer. This episode is the way that this episode handles what is going on is so Next Generation. I could see this exact same episode happening in Deep Space Nine, except it would be totally, totally different, the outcome. The morality of the Federation is perfect in this episode. It starts with even Maxwell, his line about we don't start wars. Like in a more nuanced kind of series, there would be some sort of hypocritical statement there that he's saying that he's not really being aware of. But in this show, the Federation does not start wars. And I think that's interesting. I think it's something different that Deep Space Nine does. And, Picard's sort of moral stand at the end is pure Next Generation. I think it's interesting. I don't disagree with you, but I have a different reading on that ending. I think that it's actually a bit bleaker than I think TNG generally goes for. And one of the reasons why I like this episode so much is that it shows that, it doesn't stray too far from, sort of Roddenberry's overly, rosy conception of what the Federation and what humans would be like in the 24th century. But at the same time, it shows that they're not naive. And I think that that's what I really like about it. I think that there's a tendency in Star Trek for aliens to sort of think that the Federation doesn't know the score. And one of the things that Patrick Stewart was so good at playing on this show, and one of the reasons why the show in an episode like this, when it's firing on all cylinders, it's really, really fantastic, is that he's able to project that sort of steely, clear-eyed, I know exactly what's going on. I'm not going to call you on it because I know that
if I actually went through with this would mean a war would happen. The Federation does believe in peace. And if they believe, I mean, and you even see this in like the Seeds of the Maquis later on down the line, where the Federation is making a bad treaty because they want to keep the peace. And the Federation is willing to essentially throw away, colonists are essentially willing to overlook the fact that Cardassia is building a military installation. I think he says that it's within striking distance of 3 Federation sectors or something like that. That the Federation way is always more, we're going to keep an eye on you. We're going to let you know that we know what's going on. So don't think you can get away with anything.
Yeah, it's I mean, the Admiral who tells Picard the mission, explicitly says, peace at any price. And the price turns out to be, allowing the Cardassians to stockpile some weapons, which turns out to be a darker price than you would think, yeah.
Well, I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the other thing that I think is, this is something again that we talk a lot about on Trekabout, but one of the I think the key differences between the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine is that in the Next Generation, alien species and generally everyone acts in good faith, and everyone is sort of on the level. And in Deep Space Nine, that's very much not the case. One of the things that I've always cautioned Richard about is sort of like, he's definitely learned lessons from TNG that in general, everyone is telling the truth on that show. Yes. And in Deep Space Nine, I kind of just ask him questions sometimes like, he could be, just say like he could be lying, this is a very different sort of take on it. And I think that you start to see that in The Wounded a little bit.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is that Picard doesn't believe him for a second. Like, that was really clear to me this time that he's extremely cold during the entire episode to Gul, not Dukat. He
Gul do not.
He isn't impressed for a second with him. He doesn't even take a moment where he thinks that, Gul, whatever, might be sincere or, not lying or telling the truth. And yeah, this is, again, he has a coldness that I don't think, Sisko certainly doesn't have even when Sisko is feeling something very strongly, you would never say he's cold or detached almost. But yeah, Picard is very stoic in this episode.
Yes, he's reserved, even though he starts off the episode by sort of reprimanding people for saying they want more security, which seems to make sense, so that he sort of goes the opposite direction. I agree, though. He's the difference, I suppose, like another additional sort of Deep Space Nine difference here would be, a sort of understory here for this one is that Chief O'Brien is basically racist, right? That's kind of like the lesson learned of this story. What's that?
I would say, no, you're right. He's somebody who was in a war and still hasn't quite gotten over the thinking of them as the enemy. That's
right.
That's part of a soldier's training, that you have to think, of the people as an other. And he's at the point where he's in civilian life and he's realizing that can't work anymore in this life.
Yeah,
and that turns out to be Maxwell's, big, Picard's speech at the end when he says, if he couldn't find a place, he couldn't find a place for himself outside of war. See, and, it's a sad thing. I totally agree with that. It's the war thing. I track it towards a racist thing because no one on the ship seems to like Cardassians. Like, no matter how far or distant or close to the war you were, everyone seems to have this distrust of Cardassians. The funny thing to me is that in the TNG universe, racism kind of makes sense to me, because all the characters of a species act like that species. You know what I mean? Where Deep Space Nine doesn't really do that. It has a little bit more shades of like different characters, how they interact with their own species. So,
yeah, I mean, it's like that whole TNG thing where, one town of 4 buildings stands in for the whole planet. I mean, part of it is just this is a syndicated television show in the 1980s, and so they're doing what they can do with the budget they have. And I think that's probably one of the I think one of the only problems with the episode is that the show never really, or this episode never really, I don't know that it sells O'Brien's distrust of the Cardassians enough. I think it's a little too facile to say it's just racism, because he does try to connect with one of the Cardassian officers. He does try to not be, I guess, open about it. I don't even think that he really knows how he feels about Cardassians until he's confronted with them.
Yeah, that scene when he's talking to Keiko and he's, saying, well, I don't care about that, but I think people would feel that way. You can see in him realizing he's never quite dealt with this, and he probably, if you asked him a week before this episode, are you racist against Cardassians? He would say, well, not at all. I fought in the war, but, it's not like I go around, reading, Mein Cardassian or whatever, at
the same time, I don't think it's incidental, and I don't know. I think it has been said at this point. It's not a big spoiler if it hasn't been said, but I think that Cardassians are one of the only species in Star Trek to actually get like an epithet. Do you know? Because they do call them Cardies at some points.
Yeah, spoonheads.
Yeah, spoonheads is another one. And so I think that's kind of an interesting thing as well, where, Star Trek doesn't really do that. There's no real there's no epithets for Romulans or Ferengi or anything like that, but the Cardassians
the closest
have them.
It came was some very vague in the original series of saying Spock looked like the devil. That's about the worst they've got it.
Or calling him a green-blooded hobgoblin or whatever the hell he was saying.
A little dated with the insults.
All we know is that Bones had a thesaurus and he really liked reading it in bed.
Yeah, he's one of those people who gets emailed a word a day and just has to use it in his day-to-day activities. But
good for him for trying to stretch himself, though.
No, exactly. It's the one. Let's see. I give the episode credit because it's totally not in line with Roddenberry's original thing. I think it's weirdly done, but there's an internal ugliness to the O'Brien character here. He's they play it off because it's the war thing, right? The war makes the story feel different for some reason. I do agree that he's sort of written oddly because, they're like, oh, Chief O'Brien, could we hang out, have a beer, and talk about the transport? He's like, listen, you motherfucker, I don't want to hang out with you. And then he goes back to Keiko, and she's like, what do you think about the Cardassians? He's like, I like them just fine. He seems totally disconnected from what he's talking about.
I think the only thing that this episode is really missing is a scene where O'Brien is having a counseling session with Troy, because obviously the man has a lot of problems he needs to work out.
Yeah.
Is Troy even in this episode?
For 2 minutes, I think.
Yeah, they say that I think that they get rid of her because they wanted Golmacet to sit in her seat. And so I think no, I'm serious. At the beginning of the episode, they kind of hand wave her away by saying something like, there's a lot of people on the ship that served, in the Cardassian War, and so you need to be with the crew. And then that was it. And she's gone for the rest of the episode.
Marina Sirtis then went and, got her hair done and, took an afternoon off. For her.
Also, Dr. Crusher's not in this episode at all, which is weird.
Oh my God, they were doing jazzercise together while everyone else was filming.
And I think I remember a bit of trivia. This is the only episode outside of season 2 that Crusher's not in, I think. I think that's a minor bit of trivia, but it's interesting. This is the one she's not in. I guess they really just wanted to surround Picard with the finest facial hair in the galaxy when they sat him in those seats. I found, did you guys find Gul Bassett's facial hair a little distracting? I found it upsetting.
I thought the whole look of the Cardassians was very distracting, and I can see why they changed it. They've got the sort of weird Tron outfit and the weird headdress thing, and it doesn't seem to serve any purpose except to be hey, these are aliens. And I think, his facial hair is ridiculous. I don't know why it's a different color than his hair.
You can dye it, Eric.
Just for Cardassians.
Maybe he was a Cardassian version of a hipster. Maybe, all the other Cardassians made fun of it. Oh, look, it's fucking gold to set. Look, I've got a soul patch. It's 2 of them. They're a different color. Oh, I'm cool. Maybe that's who this guy was.
It's totally possible.
I found it super distracting. I spent 15 minutes going, what the fuck is on his face? Like, why are they not commenting on?
I don't know what they were thinking with that. And I think it's funny to kind of compare and contrast the way the Cardassians look in this episode with the way they look in later episodes, and especially in Deep Space Nine, because they don't look the same. Like they sort of have this, especially I think you can see this in the HD version, which is now streaming on Netflix. I don't know why I just said it in that voice, but it's they have this kind of like, they're not as gray as they are as they actually are.
Yeah. They look very reptilian almost in Deep Space Nine,
they sort of had this like mottled skin thing going on. There's veins on their forehead. It's a very, their complexion is very different. And I think it does make them look a little disturbing. And I think it's a little weird because, if you want to talk about sort of the themes of the episode and how O'Brien is a racist, or is he a racist? I think that, having the Cardassians be such like an ugly makeup job is kind of a weird way to go.
Yeah. Well, I almost go the other way. The Cardassians, I would say, are the ugliest alien race that sticks around in a weird way. Like their external appearance is sort of fitting of their character as a species. Like they really went out of their way to make them really sort of unappealing to look at, which I think is interesting. They look they have like a pink tint in this one. They look more devilish than anything. They sort of have like this red glow, especially the underlings, who they obviously didn't spend as much money on the makeup for. But they're fascinating anyway. But I think we can move on to a different part here, what did you guys think of Captain Maxwell? I'm going to start this one off just by saying I think the episode is, I don't know if this was intentional, but it's pretty brilliant, I think, that you don't meet Maxwell until the last basically 15 minutes.
I love his coffee. I'll just say that.
Yeah, he's strong. I loved him in Shawshank. He's excellent in Shawshank Redemption.
Well, a little known trivia fact about Captain Maxwell is, of course, he was drummed out of Starfleet and he served his time. And after that, he opened a coffee shop called Maxwell's House.
Aww.
But he's a wonderful captain, and Chief O'Brien is willing to suck up to him and Picard in the same breath. I like Maxwell. I think he's
interesting because, I mean, I would, when you first, I mean, he's a very, the performance is excellent in that. He has, several very strong scenes, but when he first comes on, he's joking, he's friendly, you can't help but like the guy, he is very charismatic. When he has that fairly long scene with Picard, which, is background music is almost completely silent, when he starts to justify himself and, eventually he's like trying to call Picard a bureaucrat. I mean, that's when, he turns very, again, you see Picard's not impressed by him either. And you can see, you could see Maxwell trying to charm Picard onto being on his side, and, it's not working. And so he tries to insult him, and that doesn't work. And he realizes he's not going to get anywhere with that, Yeah. That's a very, two strong-willed individuals, combating each other.
Yeah, and I think you can really see why O'Brien would be so loyal to him as well, because he's obviously the type of captain that is very gregarious. He's obviously someone who the crew really likes, and I think that goes a long way towards O'Brien being so loyal to him in a way. I mean, I think it's kind of a little bit of a disservice that it comes down to, he has some emotional trauma from the death of his, wife and child. And he's like, because it just kind of reads into that sort of, it's a problem I have with a lot of television and movies, which sort of like treat psychotherapy like it's, everything is fixed, or you always have some sort of like trauma, and once you get it fixed, everything's fine. And it's not really the way that the brain works.
And especially this character has, I mean, he talks about, when he talks to O'Brien at the end about this other guy that they lost, this other
Stompy, yeah.
Yes, Stompy. And and again, another reason that Maxwell inspired loyalty, because he remembers this guy very well, and this was someone who died under his command, and this is the implication is that Maxwell knows most of his crew this well, and I would say it's the kind of a thing where yes, the wife and child, but it's not enough. I mean, he's lost a lot of people because of the Cardassian War. He's seen so many people die. He's heard so many reports of, I mean, they could have made it bigger. He feels this strongly, and he is this traumatized because, you know, he was a captain during a war. He saw some shit, you know. I think there is a lot further they could have gone with it. You're right. It does kind of undercut it by, well, just these two people died, you know.
Yeah,
and I do.
Go ahead, Derek. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was just going to say, I also do think it's interesting that you never actually see Maxwell's ship. You never see his bridge. You know, you don't see any of his crew.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's very deliberate, because I think that what is more disturbing about Maxwell in this episode and what his crew is actually doing. I mean, you know, let's not forget they did blow up 2 Cardassian ships for basically reasons that are obviously defined by the end of the episode because they're running weapons, but you know, it's still not the right thing to just blow them up,
right?
At least not in the Star Trek universe. But it really does show the degree to which Maxwell is that charismatic, and his crew would go for this. And
you know, the question for me is, did he tell his crew this is what I mean, you have to wonder how open he was to his crew about where the orders came from. Do you know what I mean? I mean, there have been plenty of times where Picard has, you know, said, all right, we're doing this. I can't explain why, you know, but just Starfleet orders, trust me. I mean, Maxwell could very well have said that, or he could have a crew who, I mean, frankly, if he's picked his crew, he's probably picked other people that he's worked with before, you know, maybe people who feel similarly about the Cardassians. And so when he finds information, you know, they're willing to, you know, go and, you know, retaliate for that. Again, it's another thing that the episode leaves ambiguous, and I think that was the right decision, frankly.
I almost wish that the show had done something about, because I think it's a little weird, the crew thing. You never see them. You know, they seem to be there because when O'Brien beams over, Maxwell says, "Not right now," when he like tries to buzz the door or whatever. So you know there's other people on the ship. I almost wish they had made it so that Maxwell had hijacked a ship and was doing this by himself as like a lone wolf. I think that would have got rid of a lot of these sort of weird issues I have about why the crew is okay with this, why no one seems to stop O'Brien when he beams onto the ship and just walks in. There's kind of a weird thing. I mean, the fact that Maxwell is in command of the ship is a little bit strange. Oh, they also mentioned at the end that the first officer takes control. The biggest problem to me in this episode is that after Maxwell has killed 700 people, Picard gives him the honor of commanding the ship to go back home.
Without an escort or anything like that.
That makes no sense to me. That's basically if you came home and found someone had broken into your house and murdered your spouse, and you're like, hey, I've had enough of you. We're going to go down to the police station, but you drive your own car. I'll follow behind you in my car because I don't want to, you know, it's like... What a weird decision to make, to send him back. That's my one not fatal, but that's my one big flaw that every time I watch this episode, I'm like, really? You're just going to send him back so he can do this again?
It's like, Picard would have stayed in the ship and would have gone and would have faced his trial and would have, you know, and all of that. But, you know, that is a very naive thing to assume that every Federation officer would do the same. At the same time, you know, TNG has established that all of the good Federation officers would go, you know, would be loyal and lawful.
Yeah, and I think again it does go back to TNG's belief that everyone is acting in good faith and you can trust everybody, and that it's just, you know, disagreements between people are not fundamental. You know, there is some common ground there, and there is something that, you know, you can find to sort of build a relationship between different peoples and different species and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
and
once we come down and get all the facts, we'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's, you know, obviously that's a little naive, but I also think that it's a nice thing to strive for. I think that the fatal problem with Maxwell, of course, is that, you know, he obviously doesn't think that. You know, he is someone, again, who's very charismatic, who you know, inspires a lot of loyalty. But I also think that there's a dark side to that, which is that he seems like the type of guy to think that if he were not directly involved in the Cardassian War, you can never know what it was like. And, you know, he trusts his own instincts and judgment over that of his superiors. You know, it's one of those things where you can kind of see that he would be a problematic captain. I don't think that this guy's record is spotless before this. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
But this guy is, in a way, This guy is kind of Captain Kirk type, though, in some ways now, because Kirk certainly made decisions, on his own without waiting to, get approval from, Starfleet and all of that. And hell, Picard himself has broken break the Prime Directive 9 times, This is it, but I think this episode is making this clear that this is going beyond the pale and going against the spirit of Starfleet, not just the law of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I think that's also the difference between the universe of TOS and the universe of the Next Generation. Because if you want to talk about, the actual state of the universe, in universe, I could have said that clearer, but anyway, is that obviously with the Enterprise in the original series, Starfleet was further away. They weren't going back to Earth every other episode. They didn't have real time communication with admirals all the time. It was a much less settled place. And 100 years later, a captain like Kirk doesn't necessarily fit into the 24th century version of Starfleet.
Well, like Maxwell has, the bureaucracy has filled the emptiness that was in the original series. Like now, you have to. I love the line Picard's like, "Where's your documentation?" Which is such a difference between the original series and this one. Like in this one, Starfleet wants documentation, about what has gone on here, which is totally antithetical to what the original series was about.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that but of course our sympathies are with Picard, because Picard is the ostensible protagonist of the show, and we believe that Picard is going to end up doing the right thing, because he always does the right thing in a certain sense, and so for him asking for documentation is. Yeah, it's a way for the show to differentiate itself from the original series, but it's also, I think, a way for the show to kind of project that it's a little more grown up, because this is a universe now where captains can't go off half-cocked and just blow up ships and not expect to have any sort of repercussions.
Yeah, and here's the thing, it's also... It's just also very telling that, Maxwell's not able to answer any of his questions for a little more proof. He's not allowed to say, if he said, yes, I spoke to this source and, here's our scanner. It shows, this kind of, metal which is used in guns and, we have a contact and here's a manifest. I mean, if he had said all of those things, it would have been a completely different story, because, then, all right, we have something and, we can deal with this and this is real. At this point, Picard's point is that you can't just do this. I mean, this would be the Federation starting a war, because without evidence, frankly, the Cardassians can claim that they were just a peaceful settlement who was attacked.
Yeah.
Well, I think Picard's problem is number one, that he doesn't like Maxwell, which is clear. But I also think that to take what Richard said a little bit further, I think that he realizes and probably understands that Maxwell is actually not very good at this. Because Picard that's again why I like the end of the episode so much, because it really does say, hey, you know what? Picard knows the score. He's not naive. He's not sticking his head in the sand. Yeah. He's just he doesn't have any proof either. But instead of going off half-cocked and trying to single-handedly prove that the Cardassians are arming for war again, which is not how the Starfleet of the Federation operates now, he is in a sense kind of using, he's just kind of able to tell Gulmaset that he knows what's happening. It's a conversation between two captains. He's not writing anything down. But if Gulmaset is a smart guy, and I think he is a smart guy, he will actually tell his superiors what this conversation was like, because he's able to see that using the information he has in a different way is better than doing what Maxwell did.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. It's an interesting little episode. I really enjoy this one. Before we wrap up, I wanted to talk about something that always kind of bothers me with the TNG stuff, and this episode is a good example of it. The Federation, right, is a conglomeration of some 100 planets or something like that. I don't know the exact number. They mention it occasionally, right?
I think it's 150. I think it was actually supposed to be like the same number of countries that were in the United Nations at some point, but I could be wrong. Right. I could be wrong about that. I don't know.
No, that makes sense. And so you have 150 planets, right, that are all sort of dedicated to a single cause and sort of doing things. I understand this is totally a logistical thing of the show, but it's always makes me laugh that for some reason, a species that seems to be totally uniform is always seen as a threat to what seems to be 150 worth of civilizations. Like, it's always just a Cardassian war. The Federation is a war with the Cardassians. How did the Cardassians manage to hold their own ground against this force that seems superior in numbers? You know what I mean?
Yeah, even if every species has the same population, the Federation still has 150 times, as many people, as many members. Yeah.
Right.
I always get the impression, this is again just my own sort of like, head canon or whatever about how the Federation operates. But, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently because I read a novel, Articles of the Federation, which was like a year in the life of the Federation president. And what makes sense to me about it is that the Federation is a lot looser of a confederacy than we think it is. And, from what we can see, all of the member species still have their own ships. It's kind of made clear that they don't really keep their own militaries, but they do have their own ships still. And Starfleet is the peacekeeping and exploration arm of the Federation. But Starfleet, as we know from Star Trek Enterprise, is also directly linked to Earth. And Starfleet really is, to a large degree, an Earth-based organization. So, alien species can attend Starfleet Academy, but they have to go to Earth to do it. So I kind of get the impression that for most of it, the Federation is obviously making treaties and is able to give, support to the member planets and things of that nature in terms of supplies and in terms of technology and things like that. But in terms of the actual day-to-day operations of the planets, I think that the Federation is pretty hands-off. And so it probably just is the case that for most of it, I think a lot of Federation planets actually probably don't have a lot to do with the Federation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see that. I could see the other way that you'd want to go is that you have the aliens, like the Cardassians and everything, have conquered worlds. That's clearly what they're doing, but you never see them on screen, which is always kind of a little bit of a weird dichotomy between it. You never see these races that they've sort of conquered outside of the Bajorans in Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, and I think that they do kind of talk about that. Actually, they talk about that a little more in the original series, I think, where they do talk about the Klingons conquering species, I think, at some point. And, the Klingons at that point were obviously much more of sort of an analog to the Mongols or something from the 13th century than they were like anything else. But, and I think they talk about that with the Romulans as well. And I think that, so there are some intimations of that, certainly.
Yeah. I think we've covered this one as far as we're going to. We're going to take a little break. I'm going to play an audio clip. Me, Eric, and Richard are going to come back with our final thoughts and final ratings for The Wounded.
One more thing Galma said. Maxwell was right. Those ships were not carrying scientific equipment, were they? A research station within arm's reach of 3 Federation sectors. Cargo ships running with high-energy subspace fields that jam sensors.
If you believe the transport ship was carrying weapons, Captain, why didn't you board it as Maxwell requested?
I was here to protect the peace. A peace that I firmly believe is in the interest of both our peoples. If I had attempted to board that ship, I'm quite certain that you and I would not be having this pleasant conversation. And that ships on both sides would now be arming for war.
Captain, I assure you.
Take this message to your leaders, Galmaset. We'll be watching.
All right, guys, we're ready to go. The Wounded. So this is the part of the show where I ask you guys to give me some final thoughts. Give me a rating from 1 to 5 where you think this episode stands. So how about you guys look at each other, decide who wants to go first?
It's a 4.
Strong 4.
Richard 1.
No. I said 4.
No. I'm giving you a 1, Richard.
No. But I'm
rating you a 1.
Oh.
I'm kidding.
1 triple out of 5. 1 triple out of 5.
I will give The Wounded a 4 as well.
Interesting, a 4. I'm going to. I give this guy a 5. I really enjoyed this episode. I might have sounded more negative than I do, but I think it's nearly perfect outside of the weird sort of writing things that has to happen every once in a while, including O'Brien's sort of schizophrenia and the decision to send Maxwell back to fly his ship home. Outside of that, I think this is probably as mature as TNG does at this point in the series. It's sort of a nuanced little ending, an interesting little thing. It's still got the high horse morality that Next Generation is very good at. He's not wrong here. It's layered with a little bit of nuance, just as so far as Picard knows that he's choosing the lesser two evils, like we talked about. I think it's really good. It's a great O'Brien episode. I love T. O'Brien. Obviously, his audition piece for where he ends up going in the next couple of years. I just think it's a really, really neat little episode. Guys, thank you very much for coming on.
You are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for humoring my talk about the Cardassians, the Federation, and everything in between. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find Trekabout?
Yeah, so Trekabout is our podcast where we talk about Star Trek, obviously. You can find it at trekaboutshow.com. And you can also find our spin-off podcast, Trekabout Presents, where we are currently going through the Star Wars franchise, which is weird for a Star Trek podcast to do, but there you are.
Do you want to know my general feeling about Star Wars versus Star Trek? And see
Absolutely,
how you guys,
yes.
how you feel about this.
Is it like Boston versus New York, where like one of them is like really silly and the other is real?
Listen, motherfucker. I live in Boston. Absolutely, New York is not a real city. It's just Boston. Hey, the Patriots won on a last-minute field goal today. Everyone should be celebrating.
I don't want to start a whole Boston versus New York thing because we would like to be invited back on the podcast at some point. But the only thing that I will say about the whole Star Trek versus Star Wars rivalry is that I kind of think it is kind of like the Boston-New York rivalry, where Boston thinks it's a real rivalry and New York is like, what's Boston?
Yes, I totally agree with that. What I think is funny about the New York-Boston thing is I think that the Yankees-Red Sox rivalry somehow translates into all aspects of the rivalry, which doesn't make sense to me. Like they're clearly Red Sox-Yankee rivalry, even though it doesn't amount to shit now. That's clearly like a defining thing. But in terms of city versus city, there's really a clear winner in that case.
Yeah.
But anyway, my Star Wars, Star Trek thing would be Star Trek has a lower ceiling that it occasionally gets close to hitting the top of. Star Wars has a much higher ceiling that it never quite gets to. So if you're looking for a media product that gets closer to attaining what it's trying to do, Star Trek wins. If you're looking for sheer awe, Star Wars wins. If that makes sense.
In other words, it's more ambitious, but doesn't quite, as we're seeing, when it's trying to hit that ambition, it just sprawls and just, sprays everywhere and just, is a mess, and Star Trek is tighter and, if not quite as ambitious, it hits more often.
Right. I mean, Star Trek is always going to go out there, and hit a single. Star Wars is either going to strike out badly or it's going to hit a grand slam. Like that's the analogy. And the thing I think is funny is that Star Wars, I think there's no media product that has more unrealized potential than Star Wars.
Yeah, I mean that's something that we'll be talking about The Empire Strikes Back this week on Trekabout Presents, and one of the things that we sort of were discussing, and especially with Richard not really seeing any of the prequels, is that I think Star Wars basically shits the bed after Return of the Jedi, and Star Trek never really did that. I mean, you could certainly make arguments that Star Trek Voyager or Star Trek Enterprise are objectively not good shows. I don't know that I would necessarily agree with that, but there is still a lot of good stuff in even minor Star Trek works. Whereas, if you look at the totality of what Star Wars has produced, I don't know that you would really say that the prequels are actually worth watching unless you're doing a weird podcast about them.
Like Tuvok is not it's not Jar Jar is what you're saying.
No, not at all. Absolutely not.
From my perspective, Star Wars is better. But that's my favorite. No, it's my favorite line of Star Wars is from my perspective, the Jedi are evil. But anyway,
Yeah.
Guys, thank you very much for coming on. You guys, everyone listening to this should go listen to their Star Wars podcast. It's been very entertaining. The first episode was just out, and listen to Star Trek as you guys continue to churn through Deep Space Nine at this point. Guys, thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And
See you
listeners,
guys.
thank you.
That sounded as sincere as when O'Brien told Picard that he was the second best captain he's served with in Starfleet. Anyway, guys, thank you for listening. You enjoyed the content, you're on YouTube, like it, a comment's appreciated. If you're on iTunes, a rating or review helps get the show out there. Thank you guys for listening, and I will see you next time.